thank you for joining again. I would appreciate it if you can switch on your cameras so that I see you, but if it's not possible because of the video connection, then just leave it. Today we will have a class on linguistic inferences about Japanese prehistory. And here you see the schedule so far. So before New Year, we focused on the debate on the origins of Japanese. We had a look at the different languages under discussion. We also discussed the methodology about how to distinguish language relatedness. And then we came to the comparative evidence for Japanese morphology and lexicon, words and grammar. And in the last class of last year, we then focused on structural features. And this year, we moved on to a more interdisciplinary approach. Last time, we had a guest lecture, or better, two guest lectures on the peopling of Japan from both an archaeological and a genetic perspective. And today we will continue with linguistic inferences about Japanese prehistory. As you may notice, I switched the program. That is, normally I thought to have the wrap up and the guidelines for the presentations next week. But as Mrs. Seibert, Daniela, pointed out to me, that would be a bit unfair for those of you who had their presentations next week, because the idea is that you submit your PDFs 1 week ahead, so you would not be able to use the tips. And that's why I changed the program. So today we will start with a few tips and guidelines for presentations. And then I will move to linguistic inferences about Japanese prehistory. And then next class, which will be the last class given by me, we will then bring together our knowledge or evidence or linguistic evidence, the language, with cultural evidence, archaeology and anthropology, and then also with genes, genetics. And then in the next 3 sessions, you will give presentations, Japanese prehistory. And then I will turn to the different methods and apply them to the case of Japanese and Trans-Eurasian relatedness. We will have a look at cultural reconstruction, at ancient contexts. We will have a look at tree building, at tree dating, and then also at the location of homelands. But first, let's have a look at the methods. How can linguists contribute something to the science of human history? One of the first methods, and that is actually something that we already explained in our methodological section, is that linguists can reconstruct an ancestral language that dates back to long before the appearance of written records. So even if we do not have any written records for our languages, we can still reconstruct an ancestral language when we compare contemporary languages or attested languages. So by comparing these languages, we can identify some of the change that took place between the languages, and we can unwind the change, so to say, and reconstruct the underlying form and the underlying meaning to a word. Just by comparing them, we can reconstruct unattested ancestral languages. And we check that with the Romance languages. Just by comparing the Romance languages, we were able to reconstruct Proto-Romance. And when we then in the end checked, our Proto-Romance reconstructions were very close to Latin, showing that this method really works and that it is really valid. We can really undo the similarities, undo the change, and go back to the underlying ancestral form. So that's the first way in which a linguist can contribute to the science of human history. We can revive never written languages from the past. A second method is that linguists can reconstruct the natural and cultural environment of the ancestral speakers. When we reconstruct a proto vocabulary, we can determine the culture that is reflected in that vocabulary. So the basic idea is that if the speakers of a certain proto language had words for, say, uh, textile tools, or they had words for agriculture or for stone tools, for certain fauna and flora, for animal husbandry, or for daring terms. If these words exist, that means that the speakers of the ancestral language were also familiar with the concepts. So by reconstructing proto-language, we can determine proto-culture. Another thing that as linguists we can do is that we can reconstruct with whom the ancestral speakers of our languages were in contact. So if there there has been ancient borrowing between a language, if we can demonstrate that a certain word has been borrowed from one language into another, then we also suppose that it diffused from one culture into another culture. So by studying these ancient borrowings, these words that traveled beyond linguistic borrowings and that were used for naming new ideas and naming new concepts, naming new cultural items, um, these words can also tell us something about the where and the when uh, ancestral speakers met each other. So by studying ancient borrowing, we can know who was in contact, where, and when in prehistory. A fourth thing that linguists can do for us is they can build language trees. And there are different techniques to build language trees nowadays. We have distance-based techniques such as lexicostatistics and automated similarity judgment program, ASGP. And we have also character-based techniques such as the maximum parsimony method and the Bayesian method. Distance-based techniques use the distance between two or more languages to generate a language tree. So they will calculate how different languages are from each other. For instance, by measuring the basic vocabulary and comparing what proportion of the basic vocabulary is shared. Like that, they can measure a distance between language, and so they can build a tree. Character-based methods work in a different way, since they focus not on distances but on evolutionary pathways. So you have, for instance, the maximum parsimony method. And the maximum parsimony principle is the principle of Occam's razor, a principle that we already discussed. And this method seeks for the tree that explains your data set by a minimum of historical changes. So you want a minimum of changes to occur, and the tree that allows for the minimum of historical changes will be the right tree. And a Bayesian tree then seeks for a tree that explains the data in quantifying how likely it is that a certain evolutionary model produced the data. So all different techniques for tree building, and tree building helps us understand and helps us visualize how a language split into different groups, into subgroups, and spread across space and time. Once that we built those trees, linguists can also help us to date the notes in the tree. If we can date the root, for instance, we can know when the ancestral speakers of our language lived. So if we are able to date the root of the Trans-Eurasian tree, we can know when our ancestral Trans-Eurasian speakers left, whether that was in the Neolithic or in the Bronze Age. That's important information about prehistory. And here you see that these methods, which we already discussed, also have a way to date notes in the language tree. The distance-based methods, so lexicostatistics and automatic similarity judgment program, dates the tree, but it is based on the assumption that language change is constant over time, so that language always changes at the same rate over time. For instance, it is thought that in 1000 years, 80% of the basic vocabulary will remain and 20% will be lost. So, on the basis of that idea, these methods calculate time depth or an age of a language tree. However, these approaches are no longer very much accepted today, as they are a bit unrealistic, because we know now that language never changes at a constant rate. It can change quickly in some cases, it can take a long time to change in other cases. So these dates from lexicostatistics may give us a certain clue, a certain indication, but they should be taken with a grain of salt, because the deeper you go, the more problematic they become, as language does not always change with a constant rate. And then the Bayesian statistics technique has also a way to date notes in the family tree, but they do it in a different way, using what they call a relaxed molecular clock. So these Bayesian techniques are applied to language, but they were imported from molecular anthropology, from genetics. So they use the same techniques, the same relaxed clock techniques as in genetics. It's a very complex technique, but it is not based on a constant rate of change. It allows different ranges of change at different times. And that is why Bayesian techniques are thought to be more accurate. Of course, also using cultural reconstruction, we can date our language tree, but in a more relative sense, not in an absolute sense. So we can always give a certain time span for when a certain cultural item was found at a certain place. So, for instance, if you can reconstruct agriculture to your language family, it means that your language was spoken in a period and a place where there was agriculture. But that's more that cultural reconstruction will give you only broader time spans. And then the last thing that linguists can do for you, and that linguists can do for the signs of human history, is they can locate ancestral speech communities in space. There are different linguistic methods for doing that. An old technique is the diversity hotspot principle. That is a principle that says that the homeland of an ancestral language is closest to where you find the most diversity with regard to the deepest sub-branches of the language. So if you have languages belonging to different branches of your family, many different languages in a certain region, that could well be the homeland of your language family. A schoolbook example for that is the Austronesian languages. There we find a very high variety of Austronesian languages on only one island, that is Taiwan. And that's why people think that the Austronesian expansion started from Taiwan. Then we also have cultural reconstruction by reconstructing certain cultural concepts, certain cultural items. We can delimit a certain area where this cultural item was present and exclude other neighboring areas. And then finally, the Bayesian algorithm also has a technique which is called Bayesian phylogeography that helps us determining the homelands for the nodes in our tree. So that's what we can do. We can reconstruct culture. We can have a look at contact, language, ancient contact. We can build trees, date trees, locate ancient speech communities. So let us now try to apply these different approaches to our language family, to the relatedness of Japanese and the Trans-Eurasian languages. We already saw a lot of etymologies, basic vocabulary etymologies. I know that giving data is not always like a very exciting thing. It tends to be a bit boring, but I think that especially in the case of Japanese and the Trans-Eurasian languages, where there is so much debate going on about the evidence, it is very important to point out to you what the evidence really is, and to make a kind of analysis of strengths and weaknesses. And that is also why I decided to devote two entire classes to basically all the evidence, be it in the basic vocabulary, the words and the morphemes, be it in the structure of the language. But in addition to all this basic vocabulary that we already discussed, we can also find some etymologies, some cognates between Japanese and the other Trans-Eurasian languages that are not in the sphere of basic vocabulary, but that are rather cultural items. And it is certainly striking that there are a few etymologies between Japanese and other Trans-Eurasian languages that seem to go back to Trans-Eurasian words relating to agriculture. So, for instance, there is this word in present day Japanese hata for field that comes from an old Japanese pata, and that matches with Middle Korean pat for field, and with an atus with a lost p in Turkic, irrigated land. And like that, it looks as if we can reconstruct a Trans-Eurasian word, pata, meaning field for cultivation. There's also a verb tari, to cultivate, that is well represented across the Altaic languages, with Old Turkic tare, to cultivate, Manchu tari, and Middle Mongolian tari. In Korean, it's a bit more speculative, because we have a tari in Korean for turn over soil and sow, but the vowel does not regularly correspond to the a vowels. So it may well be that we have this root here in Proto-Altaic, but not that it does not go back all the way to Proto-Trans-Eurasian, if the Korean is not the right cognate. And then we have a root for seed, millet. In Old Japanese, for instance, you have pie. In Japanese now, that's hie for barnyard millet. That corresponds to Middle Korean psi or pi, and to also fisi in Manchu and other Tungusic languages, and hissi in Middle Mongolian. This leads to the reconstruction of an ancestral word, pisi, for seed or millet. And there's also a kind of produced millet porridge or a cooked cereal. In Old Japanese, ame, gluten. I don't think the word is present in contemporary Japanese, but it is in many Ryukyuan dialects. Then you have Middle Korean am for cooked cereal, thick rice soup, and you have a Middle Mongolian amun for broomcorn millet or cooked cereal. So all these words probably go back to an amme in Trans-Eurasian for cooked cereal or broomcorn millet. These and many other words, well, many, I think that it's possible to find at least six more or even a bit more other words relating to agriculture, suggest that the speakers of the Trans-Eurasian proto-language had words for field for cultivation, to cultivate, seed, millet, broomcorn millet porridge, and so on. So if these Trans-Eurasian speakers has had words for these concepts, it also means that they were familiar with these concepts. If you have words for agriculture, for sowing and seeds and so on, you are probably also familiar with the activity of farming. So that's the idea that underlies. We can say, or we can deduce, that the speakers of Trans-Eurasian were an agricultural society. So they were a Neolithic society. They were not Paleolithic, they were Neolithic. They knew agriculture. Interestingly, we also find what I call a sophisticated textile technology. We know that people in the Paleolithic, hunter gatherers, could already sew. They had animal skins, and they sew these uh, skins together to make clothing. So sewing is certainly not something that is connected with only the Neolithic, and sewing is not something very advanced. Very primitive people, the hunter-gatherers already had sewing. But what is more surprising is that Trans-Eurasian has also reconstructions for weaving and spinning. And we know that weaving requires a loom and spinning requires an instrument. And that are techniques that are usually connected to societies that have the means for specialization. If you are a weaving and spinning society, it means you have people who are doing weaving and spinning as a job. So they can specialize in weaving and spinning while other people go out for food, or while other people are working uh, in the land. So that's why spinning and weaving are considered to be a more sophisticated textile technology, because they're connected to more advanced Neolithic societies that already know agriculture. So in this way, you can use spinning and weaving vocabulary also as a kind of evidence that the people were agricultural. So the concrete etymologies here, we have no Japanese participant, but for instance, we have Middle Korean shil, thread, that then corresponds to a number of verbs for to sew, sura in Old Turkic, sera in Nanai, siri in written Mongolian. Then we have the oru in Japanese for to weave. That corresponds to Korean wool, a strand of rope. And then you have her to plait in Khalach and other Turkic languages, hor, tie around in Mongolic, and foro, to spin in Manchu, that lead to the reconstruction of a form poro with a meaning weave. In Old Japanese, there's also the word tsumu for spindle, and in Tungusic languages, here Evenki as an example, you have a verb tum, to spin, and also in Middle Mongolian you have tomu, to spin. These vowels and consonants correspond regularly according to the rules that we established on the basis of the basic vocabulary, and we can reconstruct tome, to spin, in Trans-Eurasian. And there also seems to be you probably know modern Japanese kiru, to cut. This verb seems to be related to textile technology because the deverbal noun in Old Japanese is kiri, an owl, and that is a little instrument to make holes in cloth. And also in Turkic, kır means to strip hair or to scrape, and in Manchu, giri means cut a strip, uh, and the derived instrument is a knife for trimming cloth. So it looks as if the cutting took place in a context of cloth. So that are four etymologies that derive in the sphere of cultural vocabulary, namely textile technology. And then we have also etymologies that seem to point to fermentation as a technique for food preservation. So it looks as if our ancestral Trans-Eurasian speakers fermented their food, and most probably what they fermented was like vegetal food. Still today, if you look at the Japanese and the Korean cuisine, there's a lot of fermentation going on. There is kimchi in Korean, there's miso in Japan, this bean paste, and also many alcoholic drinks like sake, rice wine, are based on fermentation, lactic acid fermentation. So there's a lot of fermentation going on in these cuisines, and that is probably a thing that is very old and that goes back to the first ancestral societies. And when we look at the etymologies, there also seem to be semantic connections that point to original fermentation meaning or fermentation verbs. For instance, in Old Japanese, we have saka, rice wine, like still represented in Japanese in izakaya, a pub, a cafe. This saka is still there in present day Japanese. Of course, you also have sake for rice wine, which is the same word, derives from saka plus an substantivizer i. This saka can be derived from an old petrified root that probably meant to ferment and is in Old Japanese still reflected in verbs like saku, to bloom, and sakara, to be in heat, to be at peak. So a kind of fermenting process that led to rice wine. In Middle Korean, sak still means ferment and rot. And then, interestingly, although in this eastern branch of Trans-Eurasian, you have this meaning, probably the preserved meaning of fermenting, rotting, heating up. In the on the eastern steppe in Turkic and Mongolic, these languages came to mean to milk. So in Mongolian, written Mongolian here, for instance, you have sara, that is first to ferment, but has also developed a meaning to milk. And in Old Turkic, you have also sak, which means to milk. Originally, when I looked at these etymologies in my doctoral dissertation in 2005, I must say that I threw them off. So I evaluated these etymologies and I said, no, this evidence is not permissible, because when you compare the meanings fermenting and milking, I didn't see the connection. I thought that's way too far. That's dangerous semantic comparison. Let's just throw that off. And there was another etymology with a similar semantic connection, namely, you had sui in Japanese, to be sour or vinegared. Like sushi, for instance, is what is sour, what is vinegared, what is fermented. And then su in Korean, like in suida in Korean, becomes sour. It was clear that those went together, but I didn't see the connection at first with verbs like for be filtered in Turkic, from which süt, milk, is derived, or su, be filtered in Mongolic, from which sun, milk, is derived. Again, I thought that this connection between fermentation and uh, daring was way too far and I threw it off. But then later, I met Tina Warrener, actually a colleague at the Max Planck Institute, um, who investigates daring across the world and the bacteria and the fermentation processes that go on in daring. And it became clear to me that there's a very close connection, especially on the eastern steppe, between fermentation and daring. For instance, the Mongols and the Kazakhs, contemporary people living on the eastern steppe today and living on daring, on pastoralism, and living on cheese and milk production, uh, it is very surprising to see that these people have a very low lactose tolerance. So most of the people of the Kazakhs and the Mongols are totally lactose intolerant. So that's very strange because populations that live on daring normally are not are lactose persistent and not lactose intolerant. So it already indicates that this daring was developed relatively late in their history because there are lactose intolerant populations that live on dairying. And these populations, in order to make the milk digestible, they need to ferment the milk. So they cannot drink raw milk, but they always need to ferment it. And these fermentation processes are what they call lactic acid fermentation. And it's exactly the same fermentation process that is used to make kimchi and to make miso as is used to make cheese and milk products on the eastern steppe. So the bacteria and the fermentation process is exactly the same. And that made me think that this weird semantic connection that I found in my etymologies between ferment and milk may not be so strange after all, knowing this whole background of fermentation. And here, I think that what really happened is that the Trans-Eurasian people originally fermented vegetables for food, and that these fermentation verbs and techniques were recycled and applied to daring on the eastern steppe by individual Turkic populations and individual Mongolic populations, probably only from the Bronze Age onwards and later. So, whereas the original fermentation is Neolithic and applies to green stuff, to vegetables, later on the steppe, these verbs were recycled as daring verbs. This is it for what we can reconstruct about the culture through cultural reconstruction. But not all words are cognates. Not all words go back to a common ancestor. Many of the words that are similar across the Trans-Eurasian languages are the result of prehistoric contact, very early contact. So they are not going back to a common ancestor, but they are transferred from one language into another. And one such typical word is the word for horse. So we see, for instance, that it is possible already in Indo-European, so entire language family totally in the West, to reconstruct a word mark for horse. You have the German word Mere for a female horse that goes back to the same root, mark in Indo-European. The word is not attested in Tocharian, but our attestations of Tocharian are very fragmentary and limited. So you could think that the Indo-European word for mark horse had a reflex in Tocharian, which is an Indo-European language. And from there, it might have been transmitted to Old Chinese, because we already find in Old Chinese reconstructions dating back to 1300 BC and later, we find this reconstruction mrak for horse that is very close to the original mark in Indo-European, and thus probably is the borrowing. And then we see the word for horse moving across the steppe from west to east. It enters the eastern steppe here in Mongolic, where it's borrowed as mori, and Mongolic then adds a native suffix n, a singularative suffix n to the word. And the complex word in Mongolic is then borrowed as Tungusic murin and goes further in non-Trans-Eurasian languages like Amuric, Nifk, where it is muring. So the Chinese word also gets borrowed separately in Japanese as uma or muma horse, and in Korean as mal horse. So this is an example of a word that has been thought to be related by some scholars, but later we found that this is a typical example of prehistoric contact. And there are many, many such words that show similarities across the Trans-Eurasian languages that go back to this period of horse-ridden pastoralism. So we know that horse-ridden pastoralism entered the eastern steppe very late. It came from the western steppe to the eastern steppe only in the first millennium BC. It crossed the Altai, and from there it spread more and more eastwards. So horse-ridden pastoralism reached the east really late, and that is probably also the time, this Bronze Age time, 1000 BC, when this word became borrowed from one language into the other. The thing is that we have a very extensive inventory of such borrowings, of prehistoric borrowings relating to horse-ridden pastoralism. And we have only very few words that reconstruct back to Proto-Trans-Eurasian relating to agriculture. So the fact that we have this extensive borrowing, this extensive contact, ancient contact going on in a language family leads to the confusion with linguists. So that is exactly the reason why linguists for such a long time had such a hard time in distinguishing the borrowings from the cognates. As these borrowings are prehistoric, they go back to the Bronze Age, they are very difficult to tell apart from the cognates that are a bit earlier, that go back to the Neolithic. And the cognates are very few in number, while the borrowings are very extensive. And that confusion is exactly, in my opinion, what causes this big trans-Eurasian debate, this debate between people who think that everything is borrowed and others who think that a small core of evidence is perhaps not borrowed, but is related. The big trouble is the fact that in prehistory, in the Bronze Age, you had these very, very extensive contexts in the light of the spread of horse-ridden pastoralism, and that led to the masking of cognates and borrowings. But then going from cultural contact to the third thing that linguists can do for prehistory, namely tree building. And applied to Japanese and the Trans-Eurasian languages, we see that over the last 100 years, a number of trees were proposed, but by many different linguists. But it is interesting to see that these trees converge in many aspects. The only aspect, this is basically the four only trees that have been proposed, the only four configurations that have been proposed for Japanese and the other Trans-Eurasian languages. And although the trees converge, there's one big point of dispute, and that is the position of the Tungusic branch in the tree. As you can see in this tree, the Tungusic branch comes in the middle. It's one out of three branches that splits from the ancestral language family. And here, in another classification proposed by Blažič and Schwarz, Tungusic is a part of the Japano-Koreanic cluster. So it splits away from Japano-Koreanic and it clusters more closely with Japano-Koreanic than with Mongolic and Turkic. And then in the third tree, we see that Japano-Koreanic is separate from Altaic, but here Tungusic is the first to split off from Mongolo-Turkic. And then finally, in the last tree, we see again a split between Japano-Koreanic and Altaic, but here Turkic is the first to split off, and Mongolo-Tungusic form a very tight cluster. Originally, in my 2015 book, which is based on classical historical comparative linguistics and integrates morphology, I thought that this was the right classification. But then in 2018, together with a Bayesian computational specialist, Remco Boeckhaert, I did a kind of preliminary testing of basic vocabulary etymologies using Bayesian techniques. And then that was the tree that came out. So we got a tree where Tungusic was the first to split off. However, at that time, we realized that our data set was maybe not big enough. And over the last 4 years, we collected a huge database of Trans-Eurasian basic vocabulary across 100 different Trans-Eurasian languages for 250 basic vocabulary concepts spread over about 3,000 different etymologies, 3,000 different roots that were compared. And that brings us to, I think, about 30,000 different data points for analysis. And running a Bayesian analysis on this bigger expanded data set, we again get this original tree. So just recently, I received the analysis. It's not published yet, so don't spread it. But the idea now is back to basic, actually, that in our analysis we see that Japanese and Korean comes out as one branch of the Trans-Eurasian family, and Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic then form another branch, the so-called Altaic branch. So here we have Japano-Koreanic, here we have Altaic. And in Altaic, Turkic, all the Turkic languages here are the first to split off, while Tungusu Mongolic splits later in Mongolic languages and Tungusic languages. So it seems that this tree, which was most pushed by classical historical comparative linguists, is also the tree that comes out using Bayesian inference methods on a completely different data set. So as we said, with such methods also come datings. We are able, using Bayesian methods, for instance, we are able to date every single point, every single note in our language tree. And here I just look at the root of the tree that is at Proto-Trans-Eurasian, the ancestral language, and we find that using lexicostatistic methods, people before proposed 6000 BC. Other people proposed 4750 BC using a similar data set. Automatic Similarity Judgment Program has proposed 6231 BC. And now in the new Bayesian approach, which I just did with Remco Boeckhaert, we find a date that seems to be 1 millennium older, namely 7181 BC. Note that there is quite a large probability interval between 3500 and 10,000 BC. And then in cultural reconstruction earlier, I had proposed a date of 6200 BC. In any case, it seems that this dating of the Trans-Eurasian route will lie somewhere in the 7th to 6th millennium BC. Here you see then the dated family tree plotting the Bayesian dates on the tree. That is 7000 BC for the first split in Trans-Eurasian, 4800 BC for Turkic populations splitting up, and then here 3500 BC for Japanese and Korean populations splitting up, and 2500 BC for the breakup between Mongolic and Tungusic speakers. Interestingly, among the opponents of the Trans-Eurasian idea, there are people who agree with only a small part of the family tree. And so there's, for instance, this fervent opponent, Professor Jan Hunen from Helsinki, who does not agree with Trans-Eurasian classification, but he is ready to accept Mongolo-Tungusic. And if you look at this branch, you see that it is the youngest branch, so the branch that has split most recently and therefore left most evidence, probably. And that might also be the reason why Professor Jan Hunen is ready to accept this, because the evidence is much stronger, as it did not split so deep in time. The same is true for Japanese and Korean. There are some people accepting Japano-Koreanic who do not accept Trans-Eurasian as a whole. And again, the reason for this may be that the split of this sub-branch is much more recent and therefore yields more evidence. Here we come then to the final point, namely locating the Trans-Eurasian homeland. In the past, people have proposed a pastoral hypothesis for Trans-Eurasian. And in the idea of the pastoral hypothesis was that the Trans-Eurasian or Altaic people originated in the Altai Mountains at the eastern steppe side of the Altai Mountains, and that they from there spread eastwards to Korea and Japan and the Russian Far East. In this, one of the problems with this pastoral hypothesis is, of course, that today we know that pastoralism only entered the eastern steppe around 1200 BC. So horse-ridden pastoralism came only to the east in the first millennium BC. So that means that the whole spread of Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, all these languages across the east should have taken place in less than 3,000 years. So that would mean that it's a very recent family. And if this is really the case, it is very surprising that the evidence is so weak so far. So that was the idea proposed by Menges, Miller, also Dubos more recently, and it is also at the basis of the name Altaic for this family, as it proposes a homeland in the Altai Mountains and relates the family to pastoralism. I challenged this idea in my research, saying that the Trans-Eurasian homeland was probably not in the Altai Mountains, but that it was situated here in the West Liao River region, which is which is the place where you had the first farmers in East Asia. So the first farmers in East Asia were millet farmers and lived here in the West Liao River region. So I connected the roots of the family with the first farmers who lived. We have dates for farming starting around 6200 BC within the so-called Xinglonghua culture, but now archaeologists are finding dates that are even earlier than 6200 BC. The late Sergei Starostin had a similar idea as mine, in that he also reconstructed agriculture to Proto-Trans-Eurasian. So he seems to connect Proto-Trans-Eurasian not with a pastoral population, but rather with an agricultural farmer population. And but he connects this family with the Yellow River and the Yangshao culture around 5000 BC, which was also an agricultural culture, knowing millet agriculture. Um, the only thing is that recently people have identified this Yangshao culture as the speakers of Sino-Tibetan, so it is unlikely that they were speakers of Trans-Eurasian. So using then the methods that I introduced to you, that is Bayesian phylogeography, very recent, not published yet, but also cultural reconstruction and this hotspot principle, diversity hotspot principle, all these techniques point to a similar place of origin for the Trans-Eurasian languages, namely totally loose from our knowledge about archaeology or agriculture. They purely using purely linguistic tools, they all situate Trans-Eurasian in the West Liao River area, which is exactly the place where agriculture originated. Um, from there, we think that the Trans-Eurasian languages spread after 7000 BC to the Russian Far East, Tungusic to the Russian Far East, Koreanic to the Korean Peninsula, Japanic probably over the Liaodong Shandong interaction sphere to Korea, and from there to Japan, and then the Turkic languages to Mongolia, while the Mongolic languages remained first in the area and then went up. Interestingly, also recently research has been done that connects here this Liao Yangshao culture in the Yellow River region to Sino-Tibetan. In 2019, people dated it to 5200 BC. Just recently, in a paper that will soon appear in Nature, they find a date of 6000 BC. So if Sino-Tibetan was farming in 6000 BC and placed in the Yellow River Basin, they were probably contemporaneous to our Trans-Eurasian farmers who were situated between 7000 and 6000 BC in the West Liao River area. And then we get this split from Trans-Eurasian. You see a split between Altaic and Japano-Koreanic after 7000 BC. And then you see how Altaic splits into Mongolo-Tungusic that remains in the area, and Turkic that moves towards the eastern steppe. And then around 3500 BC, we see that Koreanic splits off from Japonic and goes to the Korean peninsula, and that Tungusic splits off from Mongolo-Tungusic and goes to the Russian Far East. And then around 1000 BC, it takes as long for Japonic to move away from the coast of the continent, go to the Korean peninsula, and cross to Japan with the Japanese language. Remember that last time there was this discussion about Jomon and Yayoi populations. It were the Yayoi populations that introduced farming in Japan 900 BC, and this also seems to be the date that Japonic arrived on the Japanese islands. So most probably these Yayoi farmers brought Japanese to the Japanese islands. But that is a topic that I would like to cover next week when we're going to bring together the archaeology initiated by Mark Hudson last time and genetics by Ning Chao last time. So basically, very rudimentary, the spread of Japonic to the Japanese islands started somewhere in the West Liao River Basin, 7000 BC, went first to the area of the Liaodong-Shandong interaction sphere and the coasts here of the Bohai Sea. First, Korean split off and went to Korea 3500 BC. Japanese remained here until 1300 BC when it went to the Korean peninsula. There were communities of Japanic people here on the Korean Peninsula, and only 900 BC, Japanese spread from the south of the Korean Peninsula with the Yayoi immigrants to Kyushu. And then 700 years later, it went from Kyushu and spread over mainland Japan. So that is the journey of the Japanese language in a nutshell, the language of your interest. And I see it is exactly 3:45 now, so time to say goodbye. And I hope to see you again next time. And I thank you for your attention. If you have questions, I will stay here for another 15 minutes so that you can ask them. So bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.